West Virginia, a county in the southern coal fields. Early morning, February, early 1950s. A Wayne-bodied school bus sat idling at the mouth of a hollow road, engine running 11 minutes before the first stop was due. Not because the schedule required it, but because the driver had learned that a cold engine on this grade needed that long before the brakes responded the way a loaded bus climbing back down would need them to. No trip sheet specified 11 minutes. The driver had arrived at that number through 2 winters of finding out what happened when the number was shorter. The road ahead was not marked on any state highway map as a road at all. It was a county route, unpaved, following the curve of a creek up into a hollow, where 11 families lived along a 1.5 miles of switchbacks that gained several hundred feet before the first farmhouse. A standard passenger bus could not make the second turn. That fact was not a deskin eliminating anyone apologized for. It was the reason this particular bus, smaller, shorter in wheelbase, built to turn where a longer body could not, had been assigned to this route rather than a larger one. The driver had made this same climb, in some form, perhaps 6,000 times. 6,000 times meant the driver knew things about this hollow road that had never been written down anywhere. Not in a maintenance log, not in a route sheet, not in anything the County Board of Education kept in its files. What the driver knew this particular February morning was that the frost had come out of the ground overnight in a way that meant the second switchback, which looked solid, was not. The bus started forward anyway, slowly. The driver had already decked how slowly, before reaching the curve. What did this driver know about the specific hollow road, tes curves, tes famils, its ground, that no county transportation record had ever required to be recorded? And what would the children waiting at the mouths of these hollows, 6,000 mornings worth of them, come to know about this same road that no one had ever set out to teach them? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of American school bus culture from 1930 to 1980. What the bus was, how the route worked, and what the driver and the children inside it knew that no school district record ever captured. Not nostalgia for yellow buses, the documented operational and human reality of a system that carried an entire generation to school. Even if you never rode a mountain route, this is a record of what Dali Repetin builds into a driver's hands and a child's memory when the road self refuses to be simple. And if you rode a school bus in THS era, or drove one, put it in the comments. If you rode a mountain route through West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, or anywhere similar, what was the one landmark that told you exactly how far you were from home or from school? The road paving programs that eventually reached these hollows changed more than in pavement, and that transition, county by county, is a documented chapter this channel will return to. Back en route, the bus itself was not chosen because anyone found it charming. County boards across the southern West Virginia coal fields, purchasing buses through the 1940s and into the 1950s, kept smaller, shorter wheelbase bodies in service specifically because a full-size 60-passenger bus could not physically complete the turns that mountain hollow roads required. This was not a preference. It was a geometric fact, documented in period photographs and captioned plainly in the local press of the day. The small buses were retained because they were more maneuverable on treacherous, winding mountain roads, where a larger vehicle simply could not turn. That single operational requirement shaped everything else about the vehicle's design, as it was actually used here. The body sat on a shortened chassis. The wheelbase was tight enough to complete a switchback in one pass. Rather than the multi-point turn a longer bus would have needed on a road with no shoulder to back into, the all-steel body construction that had become standard by the 1940s was not a luxury. A county board that had already seen one bus go down a 60-foot embankment near Bramwell in 1945. A collision the bus's steel body survived with every child aboard escaping with only minor injuries, had reason to specify it as an operational requirement, not an upgrade. What the vehicle asked of the driver in return was straightforward and unforgiving. Attention! A shorter wheelbase and lighter body responded differently to a loaded climb and an empty descent, to a road surface that was gravel in August and either mud or ice depending on the week in February. The bus gave the driver maneuverability. It did not give the driver a margin for not knowing the road. What did 14 or 20 years behind the wheel of a vehicle built for exactly this kind of tolerance-free driving actually teach a person about a road that changed with every season? What a driver on a route like this came to know, after enough years, was not the road as a fixed thing but the road as a set of conditions that changed by the day, and sometimes by the horrid changed by the day, and sometimes by the hour. A stretch that carried a loaded bus safely on a Tuesday morning could turn unreliable by Tuesday afternoon if rain had moved through the higher elevations, because water that fell on a ridge above a hollow road did not stay where it fell. It traveled downhill through soil that had nowhere else to go, and it reached the road below in its own time, sometimes hours after the rain itself had stopped, and the sky above the bus had already cleared. Drivers who worked mountain routes of this character in this parade describe constantly learning to read a road surface the way a person reads weather, not by what conditions were dong at the moment the bus passed over a given stretch, but by what conditions had been dong on the hugger ground for the past day or two. A driver who had worked the same hollow route through enough winters and enough spring thaws came to know which spexy curve held water after a ran, and which one drained clean, which shaded stretch under a rock overhang held ice 2 days after every other part of the road had gone dry, and which grade turned to a surface with no traction at all when the temperature crossed a particular threshold that had nothing to do with the calendar, and everything to do with the specific angle of that particular hillside to the morning sun. None of this was written anywhere the driver could consult. A state road commission map from this period, of the kind used to plan and label bus routes across counties like this one, showed the road as a line, a fixed, unchanging fact. It did not show, and had no mechanism to show, that the third mile of that line behaved differently in March than it behaved in October, or that a specific patch of shade meant a specific hazard that only revealed itself to someone who had already been surprised by it once, and had spent the rest of that winter watching for it every single morning afterward. This was knowledge built the only way this kind of knowledge could be built: by driving the same specific stretch of ground enough times, in enough different conditions, that the ground itself became legible. A new driver assigned to this same route, arriving with a valid license, a working knowledge of the vehicle, and no history with this specific hollow, was not incompetent. He simply did not yet know what this road did in March. He would find out the way every driver before him had found out. What happened to a route, and to the families along T, and the specific years when that knowledge had to be rebuilt from nothing, because the driver who held had left, and no one had ever been asked to wart any of to down. The knowledge a mountain route driver built over years was not only about the road under ordinary conditions, it was, just as much, about the specific moment when ordinary conditions stopped applying, when rain that had fallen steadily for 2 days turned a hillside above the road into something that could move, or when ice formed on a grade in a pattern that made the difference between a bus that could complete its route and a bus that could not. Landslides and washouts on steep grades were a documented and recurring operational risk for mountain school routes in this period and region. Not a rare catastrophe, but a recognized seasonal hazard that county transportation systems planned around as a matter of course. A hollow could be cut off from the road network entirely for days at a time after a significant slide, which meant a hollow could be cut off from the school its children were assigned to for the same stretch of days. This was not treated, in the documented operational record of counties like this one, as an emergency requiring explanation each time it happened. It was treated as a known condition of mountain routing, the way a coastal system plans around hurricanes it cannot prevent. What this meant in practice for the driver was a specific kind of vigilance that had nothing to do with the bus's mechanical condition, and everything to do with reading the hillside itself, noticing the specific places where water had begun to cut a channel had not cut the week before, where a fence post had shufted, where a patch of hulls had begun to show bare sole where grass had held the ground the previous month. None of this was in any inspection checklist issued to drivers. It was accumulated, the same way the road surface knowledge was accumulated, by being present repeatedly in the specific place where the hazard eventually showed itself. The decision to run or cancel a route on a marginal morning, heavy overnight rain, a forecast of more to come, a temperature hovering exactly at the line between rain and ice, was, in a county system of this size and period, frequently a decision made with information that existed mostly in the driver's own observation of the specific stretch of road at stake, communicated back to a transportation director who was not standing on that hillside and could not see what the driver could see. What did it mean for an entire hollow community? Not just the children, but the families who depended on that same road for every other purpose. When the road that connected them to the school and the town center simply stopped being passable, sometimes for longer than anyone outside the hollow understood, while the driver was building one kind of knowledge about this road, the children reading it twice a day were building another. And theirs was not knowledge about the road's hazards. It was knowledge about the road's rhythm, absorbed the way any child absorbs a repeated physical experience before they have language for what they are absorbing. A child who boarded at the mouth of a hollow and rode this route for years came to know the specific sequence of turns, the way they knew the layout of their own house in the dark. The switchback that meant the RD was a third fetched. The particular lean of the bus through a Spec FC curve that meant the next stop belonged to a specific family, whose children they would recognize by sound before the bus door opened. The engine note climbing a particular grade that told them, without needing to check anything, roughly how many minutes of road remained before the valley opened out, and the school came into view. None of this had been explained to them by a parent or a teacher. It had simply become part of what their bodies knew from having made this same trip, in this same sequence, hundreds of times. For children on these routes, the ride itself took on these routes. The ride itself took far longer than the straight-line distance between hollow and school ever suggested, a fact that would have looked strange on a map. It would have looked strange on a map, where a school might appear only a few miles from McGovern farmhouse as measured in a straight line. But that represented a genuinely long road once the actual switchback mileage of the mountain road was accounted for. Children who grew up on these routes did not experience this as unusual. It was simply what getting to school required, in the same unremarkable way that children in other kinds of terrain experienced a short, flat walk as simply what getting to school required. the steep drop-offs along the unguarded road, the tart switchbacks, the creek crossings without bridges. These were not framed, and the daily experience of a collie who rode this route from first grade onward, as dangers to be afraid of each morning. They were simply what the road was, in the same unremarkable register that a driver's own children absorbed the sound of that driver's specific bus in the driveway before they were old enough to read a clock. What this route built into these children, over years of repetition, was a specific geographic intelligence, a working map of a hollow and its road that existed nowhere except in their own bodies. What happened to that map? That specific accumulated knowledge of a hollow's turns and sounds and rhythms, when the child eventually grew up and left, or when the route itself was later changed. For many families along routes like this one, the school bus was not simply a way to get children to school. It was, in a genuinely literal sense, the primary regular connecting between insulated hollow and everything the rest of the school dusty trot and the nearest town represented. The only scheduled, reliable movement in and out of that specific hollow on most days of the week. A hollow of 11 or 12 families, several miles up a mountain road from the nearest paved highway, did not necessarily have Daily Mail delivery to every door, did not have a store within walking distance, and in many cases did not have a family car that made the trip to town more than occasionally. The bus, arriving on a fixed schedule twice a day, 5 days a week, 10 months a year, was frequently the most dependable scheduled contact that Hollow had with the county seat, the school, and the broader institutional life of the district. That is not a sentimental claim. It is a description of what the route's actual operational frequency made it, functionally, in communities with few other regular connections to town. This gave the driver on a route like this a social role that went beyond driving. A driver who passed the same 11 households twice a day, for years, was in a position to notice things that mattered to that community in ways that had nothing to do with school transportation as such. Whether a family's mailbox flag had gone untouched for several days, whether a normally punctual set of children had suddenly stopped waiting at their usual spot, whether smoke was or was not rising from a particular chimney on a morning it should have been. None of this was in a driver's job description. It became part of the role because the driver was, quite simply, the one person from outside the hollow who reliably saw every household in it twice a day, every school day, for years at a stretch. The school itself, at the far end of the route, functioned similarly as more than an educational building for these communities. It was frequently the one place all the scattered hollow families along a Gven route converged in the same building on the same schedule. The institution that gave a set of otherwise dispersed farms and hollows, something resembling a shared center. What did it mean for a community built this way when the road that made this daily convergence possible failed? And what did it mean, later, when the character of that daily convergence changed entirely, as routes lengthened and schools consolidated? The limitations of a route like this were not occasional failures of an otherwise reliable system. They were a structural, recurring feature of mountain school transportation in this period, documented consistently enough across countries like this one, that they shaped how transportation directors planned an entire school year, not just individual mornings. Washouts after heavy rain, landslides on steep grades, and ice on unshaded high-elevation stretches did not simply slow a route down. In their more serious forms, they closed a route entirely, sometimes for a single day, sometimes for most of a week, occasionally longer, depending on how quickly a county road crew with limited equipment could clear or repair the specific stretch involved. a road crew working with the resources available to a rural county government in this period, on a road that served a relatively small number of families, was not always post-toned to ports that repar the same weight might ports, a stretch of the same road that carried heaver general traffic. What this meant for a hollow cut off in this way was not simply a missed day of school. Depending on how long the closure lasted, it could mean missed schoolwork accumulating in a way that mattered for a child standing at school, missed opportunities for a family to reach a doctor, if the same impassable road was the only route to town, and a specific inly route to town, and a spexfork documented Gond of Soliton that Mountain Hollow Comunts in first parode understood as a real and recurring possibility, rather than a hypothetical worst case. This was simply understood by families who lived this way as one of the costs of the specific geography they lived in, not something anyone treated as unusual when it happened, but not something anyone treated as harmless either. The driver's role during a closure like this extended beyond simply waiting for the road to reopen. Drivers on routes of this kind describe, consistently, monitoring a blocked or damaged stretch themselves during a closure, checking a washout's condition day by day, reporting back on whether a specific hazard had improved or worsened, because the driver was frequently the person from the transportation system with the most direct current knowledge of that specific piece of road. What did this recurring structural vulnerability, a route that could simply fail, for reasons the community itself could not control or predict, mean for how families in these hollows planned their lives around a road they could never fully trust? The change that eventually reached routes like this one did not arrive quickly, and it did not arrive because any single county decided its mountain roads needed to be paved. It arrived as federal policy, the Appalachian Regional Development Act, signed into law on March 9, 1965, which created the Appalachian Regional Commission and, through it, the Appalachian Development Highway System, directing federal funding toward roughly 2,350 miles of new highway construction and access roads across 13 Appalachian states, specifically because the region's underdeveloped road network had been identified as a structural barrier to nearly everything else: health care, employment, and yes, reliable school access, all named directly in the documented rationale for the program. For a hollow route like this one, the paving programs that eventually followed did not happen overnight, and they did not happen everywhere at once. County by county, grade by grade, the paving programs that eventually followed did not happen overnight, and they did not happen everywhere at once. County by county, grade by grade, unpaved mountain roads were gradually rebuilt, went where the terrain allowed to, and resurfaced in a process that stretched across the second half of the 20th century, rather than arriving as a single transformation. What it delivered over time was real and measurable. Fewer closures, more predictable travel times, less dependence on a single driver's accumulated judgment about a specific patch of shaded ice, and a meaningfully lower risk to children traveling a route that had once required the kind of caution that no amount of driver skill could fully eliminate. What it did not deliver, and could not deliver, was the specific accumulated knowledge that the old unpaved route had built into the people who had lived inside it. A newly paved grade did not need a driver who could read frost heave in a dirt surface, because a paved surface did not heave the same way. A shorter, straighter, resurfaced road did not require the same switchback by switchback local knowledge that the old road had demanded, because much of what that knowledge had been built to manage, the specific unpredictability of a specific piece of unimproved ground, had been engineered out of the route itself. This was by any reasonable measure an improvement. It was also without any contradiction a disappearance. A body of expertise, built by specific people over specific years on a specific stretch of ground, that had no further use once the ground itself had been changed, and that was never recorded anywhere because no one had ever been asked to record it. The children who had once known this route by its bump and its lean and its engine note grew up, in most cases, into a world where that specific knowledge no longer mapped onto anything. The road they had known in their bodies had, in a very literal sense, been replaced by a different road running roughly the same course. What they retained was not usable knowledge of a road that no longer existed in that form. What they retained was the fact of having known a place that mately once, a fact with no further opportunal use, and no other place for it to go. If this channel is going to keep documenting what was in these routes, and in the people who drove and rode them, subscribe. There are more buses, more routes, more drivers, and more children's geographies that were built by daily repetition and never written down. Even if you never rode a mountain route yourself, this is a record of what daily repetition builds into a driver's hands and a child's memory, when the road refuses to be simple, and what a system loses, without ever quite counting the loss, when that road is finally made simple for everyone who comes after. And if you have a memory of a bus, a driver, a route, a bend in the road that told you exactly where you were, put it in the comments. If you rode a mountain route through West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, or anywhere similar, what was the landmark that told you how far you were from home? The road paving programs that eventually reach these hollows are, themselves, a documented chapter this channel intends to return to. County by county, grade by grade, a hollow route that had required 11 minutes of idling before a February descent, 6,000 mornings of accumulated judgment about ground that no map recorded, and a bus built specifically to turn where a larger vehicle could not, was, within a generation, rebuilt into a road that asked none of that of the driver who now drove it. The driver who had known the old road's every hazard was not replaced, because the driving had gotten easier. The driving had gotten easier because the road self had changed. What that driver knew about the second switchback, about the shaded ice, about the exact minute the creek came up after 2 days of rain in the hills above, none of it transferred to the new road. There was no place for it to go.